Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
Welcome to Herrenhausen Palace. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you tonight's speaker, Professor Sir Mark Walport, the Chief Scientific Advisor of the British Government and Head of the Government Office for Science. As the German government has no such thing like a Wissenschaftlicher Chefberater or whatever the German term would be, let me briefly explain what this office entails. The incumbent of this position is responsible for providing scientific advice to the Prime Minister and members of Cabinet, advising the government on aspects of policy on science and technology, ensuring and improving the quality and use of scientific evidence and advice in government, and leading the science and engineering profession within the civil service. Mark Walport was appointed to this office in April 2013. His previous career highlights include, if I might call them highlights, being director of the Wellcome Trust, I think is one of those really big achievements in the UK setup. And that's where we, for the first time, met as colleagues among the major European foundations. He was Professor of Medicine and Head of the Division of Medicine at Imperial College London. He is, among others, a member of an advisory board of Infrastructure UK, or has been, let's say. Mark received a knighthood in 2009, and he was also elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2011. Dear Mark, thank you very much for joining us tonight and sharing your insights on innovation, managing risk, not avoiding it. The floor is yours. Thank you.
So, Wilhelm, Peter, thank you very much, and I'm honored to be asked to come and speak in this splendid meeting. And, of course, I've worked closely with both of you in the foundation world, and, of course, the foundations, I think, are an important feature of the European science scene. And also, Peter worked very closely with you between the Wellcome Trust and the Max-Planck Institute, and in particular on the foundation of a new type of journal, eLife. We've heard this afternoon about a very important concept, I think, which is that of risk competence. And I think that if we're going to be able to manage risks and think about them in relation to innovation, then we have to improve the levels of risk competence at all levels, as I will illustrate. A number of other things that have come out very importantly this afternoon, and one of those is about the relationship between science and values. And I think there are two different types of relationship. One is the values of science itself. And in the last talk, when we saw the codes of conduct, we saw that the most important elements of that are actually in the leadership and the values of the organization. And that applies in business, and it applies in the enterprise of science. And I think we also heard earlier in the day some of the principles of supporting the best science, which I thought was very well summarized in the concept of hire well and then trust. It's actually all about supporting people, supporting the brightest minds, and then giving them the tools that they need, the environment, the infrastructure, to conduct the best form of science. So, Wilhelm has kindly already introduced the role of the Chief Scientific Advisor, but I thought I would say just a little bit more just to explain why risk is such an important part of the job. So my job is to take all aspects of science, engineering, technology, and social science, and that is where you have a word, Wissenschaft, that I think captures this in a way that no other word in the English language, I think, quite does. But I view it as all of the sciences. And the challenge is to provide advice in all those domains for the whole of government policy. And so how does one think about the job to make it one that is manageable? And so we think about it in terms of what are the things that government really cares about. And I would suggest that good government cares about the health, the well-being, the security, and the resilience of its population. And in parallel with that, it worries about the economy, because, of course, those two are interrelated. And governments that succeed in doing that are likely to be popular governments. Now, what is it that our well-being, our health, our security, our resilience actually depend upon? And it's something that we take for granted until it goes wrong, and that is our infrastructure. And so in this building, the most critical piece of infrastructure is actually the power supply. Because when the power supply disappears, then we have a problem, and of course the whole city of Hanover runs into difficulties very quickly. And as modern societies have become more efficient, in many ways they've become less resilient. Because one of the things that happens when the power goes out is that people go and empty the shops. And whilst governments may say, we don't want you to do that, that is an entirely rational behavior for each of us. And so shops empty very quickly. And because we now have just-in-time supply lines, it means that actually supplies of food and water can run out very quickly. So you can think about infrastructure in terms of the built infrastructure, and then you can think of infrastructure in terms of the natural infrastructure, by which I mean human, animal, and plant health, and then the geology of the planet, so earthquakes, volcanoes, and of course weather and climate. And of course one of the places where those two come together is climate and energy, and I'll come back to that. So the second thing, which is, so I worry a lot about all of those areas, and particularly about how we can have the most resilient, secure, safe infrastructure. When it comes to knowledge translated to economic advantage, then I think the challenge for government is to provide the best policy environment and the appropriate use of taxpayers' funding, as it were, funding derived from taxpayers, to bring together academia, industry, and get the right policies. Where I think having a chief scientific advisor in place is very, very important is in the area of when emergencies arise. And we had some discussion earlier this afternoon about Fukushima and the effects that that had on people's attitudes to nuclear energy throughout the world. There is a committee in the UK which is called SAGE, which stands for Scientific Advice Group in Emergencies, which is chaired by the government chief scientist. And when there's an emergency in the UK, or indeed anywhere in the world which has the potential to affect UK citizens, where science is involved, then that committee is called together very quickly. And so after Fukushima happened, the question was what advice to give to UK citizens living in Japan. And it was my predecessor, John Beddington, was able to assemble, in a matter of hours, a group of experts who knew, first of all, about radiation and nuclear energy. Then they knew about plumes, because actually any leak from the reactor was going into the atmosphere as well as into the immediate surrounds. And so who could model plumes, and knew about weather, because you need to know which direction the wind is going, where a plume will end up. And as a result of a very fast piece of work, they were able to work out that the risk to UK citizens living in Tokyo from increased exposure to radiation was negligible. And very clear advice was given through the British Embassy rapidly to UK citizens that they should stay put. And that was actually very helpful in Japan as a whole in helping to calm it down. And it's actually a good illustration of the importance of science in diplomacy, because actually we face so many common challenges in Europe but around the world in some of the big issues of the planet where science is very important. And we underuse science in diplomacy. But finally, the role is, as Wilhelm has said, it's to try and underpin policy with the best evidence wherever one can, and to provide a leadership role for science. So, turning to the main topic of this session, which is about risk, and risk in relation to innovation, as I'll explore in a minute. You've only got to be in the job for about a day or two to realize that almost every aspect of the job, and indeed a large amount of the work of government, is actually thinking about and managing risk. And so risk comes from natural events, from natural hazards, and here are three examples of issues that are more or less contemporary. So one is, and this refers to the volcano Iceland that went off a few years ago, although of course there's a volcano erupting at the moment. Is it safe to fly an aeroplane through a volcanic ash cloud? And how do you actually manage the risks associated with that? A second example is the challenge to animals from diseases such as bovine tuberculosis. And then the third example of the sort of risks that one faces, and this was my first experience of the government emergency procedures about a year ago, when you have floods. And of course, one of the important questions for government is how do you balance your investments in flood defences on the one hand against mitigating the risks, for example, of bovine tuberculosis. So there are all sorts of questions if you're in government or indeed in any other walk of life in industry about how you actually use risks to prioritise your investment. And then, of course, there are all the human-induced threats. Here you see the threat of terrorism, and of course science is very important in that, understanding the means that terrorists use. And of course the human sciences are as important as the physical and biological sciences in this. And then the risks that we impose on the environment through the measures that we've taken to adapt our environment to enable more than 7 billion people to live on the planet. And the reason that we have been so successful is because we have modified our environment. But of course the price of that is the 10 gigatons or more of carbon that we're emitting into the atmosphere each year, and the challenges that go with feeding populations, where on the one hand you have the use of pesticides, and I'll talk about some of the challenges with all of this in a minute, and then on the other hand, could one reduce the use of pesticides by making plants genetically modified and therefore able to resist pathogens and other damage much more effectively. And putting this all together, companies have risk registers, foundations have risk registers, and governments have risk registers. And so the UK has a national risk register, which is a publicly available document. And in the way that any other risk register would work, it looks on the one hand at the impact of an event, and on the other axis of the likelihood of an event. And you can see that near the top right of this figure are pandemic human diseases. And of course that is, I think, obvious to everyone. So influenza is something that we worry about. And at the moment we have a very unpleasant Ebola epidemic in West Africa, which does not pose a global threat as things stand, but is a very, very serious problem, as WHO and the UN have been making clearly in terms of what's happening in West Africa, with all of the challenges that go to civil society and the disruption of civil society when you have a severe infection. And then another one, which I think is much less well known, is the effects of severe space weather. And that's a solar coronal ejection, which causes electromagnetic storms on the Earth, and that has the potential to disrupt telecommunications, to disrupt electricity supplies, power supplies and transformers, communications. So that's another area where actually there's a great deal of collaboration between scientists around the world to try and understand how we can measure, predict, and mitigate the effects of a burst of space weather. And in fact, there has been a bit of space weather recently with the aurora borealis, which is a sort of visual cue that there's solar radiation coming in from a mass ejection. And as I say, these are all important things. And the only point of having a risk register is if you use it for 4 purposes. And those 4 purposes are, first of all, to try and prevent things happening. Secondly, in the event that they do happen, you want to mitigate them. Thirdly, you want to be able to handle them when they happen. And finally, you need to be able to clear up afterwards. Now, one of the challenges, and I think we've already come across this afternoon, is the challenge of risk competence. And one of the real problems here is the use of language, because there are some very important questions. And I think this illustration of the bird, the plover sitting in the jaws of the crocodile, illustrates most of the issues around the terminology. So the question that you might ask is, what is the risk to the plover of being in that precarious position in the crocodile's jaws? So the hazard is fairly obvious here. It is the teeth of the crocodile and its extremely strong jaw muscles, which could clamp down and cause irreparable damage to the plover. So that's the hazard. But the hazard is not the same as the risk. The difference between hazard and risk is exposure. So the question actually is that plover exposed to the hazard of the crocodile's jaws? Now, if it was our head in there, then the answer is we would be highly exposed. But the reality is that that plover knows that it's not at risk of exposure here, because actually it coexists with the crocodile, it cleans its teeth. And there's a very important thing in that. So in fact, the vulnerability of the plover is very low. It's not vulnerable, whereas a small mammal or a large mammal, in the case of a human, would be extremely vulnerable to the crocodile. And I suppose what we suffer from in all of this is potential uncertainty. In other words, we might not know. So the uncertainty is not knowing about those relationships. And the term threat really applies to human threats. So the fundamental point here, which I think comes back in again and again, is that we are sometimes in danger of thinking about and trying to regulate and legislate for hazards rather than for risks. And so our houses, for example, are full of extremely hazardous substances. Our kitchens have knives in them, we have bleach, there are electric devices that can catch fire. These are all extremely hazardous, but they pose us very little risk indeed because we manage our exposure. And what we have to distinguish between is the hazard and the risk. And actually, at some level, that was illustrated with Fukushima, with the question about citizens living in Tokyo, which is the hazard of radioactivity is very well known, but what actually matters is your exposure to it. And if your exposure is very low, then the risk is very low. And we confuse those terms all too often. And I think that unless we're able to have that very clear conversation and understand the terms, then we're in danger of not having good conversations about risk. So, innovation. As I've already said, there are only this number of humans on the planet because of innovation. We are only in this room able to live comfortable lives because of innovation. And of course, it was power, above all, that drove the Industrial Revolution, that drove us into the modern societies that we are now. But just imagine the discussion we might have now if electricity had not been, as it were, discovered and applied. You've got this stuff that you're going to put in wires in our rooms, which has the potential to give us an electric shock that will make us drop dead. You can just imagine the discussion. The hazard of electricity is enormous. And so how would we have been able to think about and regulate the innovation of electricity in 2014? What would different countries around the world think about it? So we've done an enormous amount of innovation, and indeed much of our modern society has depended on people thinking about risk in appropriate ways, or sometimes a lot of it happened before people even started thinking about risk very clearly. But it is innovation that's got us where we are. So it's about power, it's about electricity supplies, it's about all the improvements in healthcare, the development of drugs. You know, would we have introduced aspirin if we had known all the side effects of aspirin 200 years ago? It's about mass production systems, it's about better transport links. But so innovation has been key to our lives. And of course, we're going through effectively a second industrial revolution at the moment. And that's the industrial revolution of the IT age, which again, we take for granted, but has the potential to change our lives in the most extraordinary ways. And we're really only at the beginning of that. And actually, one of the things that I'm doing, which came from the British Prime Minister's visit to the CeBIT fair here earlier in the year, when he announced and talked about the importance of the Internet of Things and announced a review that, in fact, I and my office are leading for him in the UK. And we're moving towards a world where, in the Internet of Things, almost all of the objects that we live with have microchips in them, and they have the potential to be connected to wireless networks so they can connect one with another. And we're moving into a ubiquitously sensed world. And of course, the Internet of Things is already here, because I suspect that everyone in this room probably has a smartphone. And that, of course, uses GPS and is a very powerful location tool. And so we are an extraordinarily innovative generation. Our demographics are changing, our interconnectedness is changing, and of course that brings its own opportunities and threats as well. And frankly, we can only move forward if we continue to innovate. And sometimes innovation is looked at in terms of causing risk, whereas actually the reality is that we need innovation to reduce risk. Because if we don't innovate, the challenges of the way we use energy at the moment are going to cause terrible problems for future generations of humans. So we face the challenges of climate change, of resource shortage, water shortage, but other resources, challenges to food and agriculture. And if we're going to be able to live well, and if our children and their children are going to be able to live well, then we require innovation. So, there are different types of innovation, and I think it's quite helpful to think about 4 categories of innovation in terms of how we think about them and how we think about the risks. Because I think one of the mistakes that scientists sometimes make is that we think that science is the sole problem. Whereas actually it's about much more than science. It's about values, it's about costs. It's actually about how science meets society. So here's the first form of innovation in association with risk, where we've actually largely worked our way through it. So if you take the development of new medicines, those are innovations that are very widely accepted. We've worked out reasonably effective means of regulation, though I'll come back to those in a moment. From time to time, there are significant challenges about who should pay. And a good example of that is medicines and the developing world and vaccines, where the question is who should pay. But as a form of innovation, this is one that is widely accepted. And while there may be, from time to time, specific questions, this is a form of innovation that people don't worry about. Here's a second form of innovation, which causes all sorts of problems. And this is what I term science meets values. And so there are 3 examples here. There's genetically modified organisms, there's embryo research, and there's nuclear energy. And in each of these cases, and I'll come back to the science and how I think we need to discuss it in a moment, there's the issue of the science on the one hand, and then there's the issue of the values, how people think about these technologies, where, frankly, there are different situations. They're not universal values here. There can't be universal values, actually. There are cultural values, there are religious values. Different societies have a different view. And I think that that raises an important question in a confederation of countries, for example, the European Union, where inevitably, because of our histories, we have different views on each of these technologies, the value systems. It came up earlier this afternoon that embryo treatments are much more accepted in the UK than they are, for example, in Germany. And so the challenge, I think, for the European Union is how actually we manage these scientific issues where the values are contested and different in different parts of Europe. And that's a question not for the scientists, it's a question ultimately for citizens as a whole and our politicians. And I'm not trying to put value judgments, I think the challenge here is, do we go with the country that is the most allergic to any particular technology, or do we go the other end, or do we find a sort of middle place? But I think that's a challenge for a confederation of countries or a grouping of countries. So that's, I think, the second form of innovation in relation to risks. A third category, which I think everyone will recognize, which is important in infrastructure as well as innovation, is my pain, your gain, my risk, your benefit. So, for example, a high-speed train, which is built through adjacent to my house, and I have to go 100 miles, 100 kilometers to get on it. So how do we balance that? And there's quite a lot of situations like that where we have a piece usually of physical infrastructure which may be associated with innovation, be it a windmill, a nuclear waste disposal, where you have a facility which imposes risk in one place and benefits in the other. And what I'm trying to get across here is, I'm not giving you the answer to each of these, but I think that we're only going to have the best discussion if we actually think about the taxonomy in the way that we can really understand that the issues here are not purely scientific, and what you're balancing and what politicians and democratically elected citizens have to balance in order to make the societal decisions. And then the final example of innovation in relation to risks, I think, there may be others, and I'm happy to discuss this afterwards, is, if you like, unintended consequences, where a new technology is very widely and very rapidly accepted, but then you start discovering some of the problems afterwards. And smartphones would be a very good example of that. We are all extremely wedded to our smartphones. They give us an enormous amount of personal benefit. But then there are all the challenges that have come with this extraordinary revolution in information technology and the coming Internet of Things. And we can't anticipate every consequence, but we have to think about how we manage them. And I think if we start thinking about innovation in those four different buckets, recognizing that, of course, there's an overlap between them, that, sometimes it's actually a combination of values and my pain, your gain, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute, then I think we'll have the best discussion. So, coming back, I think, to what has been a theme of this afternoon, we have to, I think, have a better and more effective conversation about risk. Risk is absolutely a societal issue. And I think there's another interesting point, because I was in New Zealand just a few weeks ago, and if you're a citizen in New Zealand, which is prone to earthquakes, then the citizens there know that if there's an earthquake, they're potentially on their own for 5 days. And so there's a discussion which means that they understand the risks associated with the natural hazard of earthquakes in this case. And I think that certainly in some, I think in the UK, I think possibly in Germany, I think that our citizens tend to think that they are just completely safe and government will look after them. And so I think there is a discussion about the fact that we actually do live in a world where there are significant risks, and not all of the resilience can be provided by the state on your behalf. So that's, I think, part of the discussion as well. There's the issue of language, which I've already talked about. Just actually understanding the terms, because if you don't understand them, if you can think that hazard and risk are the same thing, then you're going to have a very bad discussion, I think. There's value in lenses, and I'll come back to that in a minute. There's the issue I've already raised about who gains the benefit and who carries the risk. There's the discussion about transparency. Is transparency simply the answer? Just put all the information out there and people can decide. That can't be the complete explanation, because actually some of this stuff does require expert knowledge. And of course, that's not an argument against transparency, but it's actually about meaningful transparency. So simply putting a load of numbers out there doesn't help anyone. It's turning numbers into information, and information ultimately into knowledge. And then I would argue that widening that conversation is a democratic necessity. So what is it that science can contribute? Well, one of the most important things that science can contribute is the best possible assessment of the state of the scientific knowledge, recognizing something very important, and that is that scientific knowledge is contingent. In other words, we know what we know at a particular time, but as new facts are discovered, as new observations are made, as new experiments will done, we will learn more, and we may change our views about things or have our views reinforced about others. And one of the things that's very important, and I think it's why the IPCC is so important, because this is actually a methodology that came out of medicine, which is that in medicine, which is my field, things have advanced by a series of clinical trials and relatively small experiments, can you decide whether to use a new drug based on a single clinical trial? Very, very rarely indeed. And so what you need to do is you need to look at all of the evidence and do what's called a meta-analysis. And it's that sort of meta-analysis, it's that sort of evidence summary that is extremely useful and important for people like me, actually, because a large part of my job is I don't have expertise in all the sciences, but I act as the transmission mechanism between the outside world of science and the inside world of government. And there's nothing that makes my life easier than a high-quality evidence review. And so the power of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is the rigor with which it's looked at all of the available evidence in relation to climate change and human emissions of carbon and other greenhouse gases. So another example, a more local one to the UK, is work done by the Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Engineering. So I think learned academies play an important role in this as well. My predecessor asked the Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Engineering to do a report on hydraulic fracturing to extract shale gas. And I'll come back to that in a minute as well. This is all entirely non-controversial areas of science, as you'll see. And then the third area, and this is an example of the European academies working together very effectively through a body called ESAC, is an excellent report called Planting the Future, Opportunities and Challenges for Using Crop Genetic Improvement Technologies for Sustainable Agriculture. These documents, conducted by impeccable scientists working together, are very important as actually the scientific contribution to the discussion. Now, another problem, I think, has been, and I think this is quite a common problem, that we tend to treat technologies in a generic way. And it's actually a completely ridiculous question to say, is genetic modification a good thing? Is nanotechnology a good or a bad thing? Is synthetic biology a good or a bad thing? Because any technology has the potential for both positive and negative uses. So if we want to have a sensible conversation about genetically modified organisms, it has to start being specific. It's actually what organism, what gene, for what purpose. If it's a piece of synthetic biology, it would be fairly obvious that changing a bacterial toxin to make it more dangerous would not be a good use of synthetic biology. On the other hand, adapting an organism, for example, so that it could sense arsenic contamination of the soil, most people would think would be a good thing. And so we make the mistake of talking about technologies as though they were generic, where no technology is generic. They're all specific in their applications. And my next point, which I think is also an important one, is that when it comes to policymakers, and the policymakers are the people that we elect, our politicians, my job is to provide the scientific advice. It's for the politicians who have been elected to actually decide what to do with that advice. And what policymakers have to do is to look at issues through a whole variety of different lenses. So let's take one which is very well known, which is the energy question. So there are really three questions if you're thinking about power supply. The first and foremost is actually security of supply. Because from what I've already said, if the power goes off, then we're in trouble. So security of supply is the first of the lenses. And then the second and third lenses that policymakers need to look through in relation to energy and power is the sustainability in relation to the challenges to the climate and the planet, and then the affordability lens. Because it's no use having a solution that then gives you energy that's so expensive that no one can afford to pay for it. And so any policy approach which looks through one of those lenses alone is unlikely to give you a sensible answer if you're a politician or policymaker. And they have to look through all of those lenses to get to the sensible policies. And again, I think that that is what science has to realize, is that science can contribute to one, to maybe more of those lenses, but ultimately there are all these different lenses that have to be looked through. And in a sense, I've already come to that with the discussion of the different forms of innovation, where you're balancing the values, you're balancing the my pain, your gain. And so putting that together, let's just take shale gas as an example. So there are really three science and engineering concerns about hydraulic fracking. The first of these is, will it cause earth tremors? The second is, will you get contamination of the water table? And the third is, will there be fugitive release of the methane gas? In other words, if you leak all the gas, then you lose the advantage of it as a fossil fuel. And what the science and the engineering tells you is that this is a drilling technology, and no drilling technology is completely risk-free. But if it is done well, if it is engineered well, if it is governed well, then it is as safe as any other form of drilling. Recognizing that there is no free lunch, there is nothing that is completely risk-free. So those are the engineering concerns, and that's what the Royal Academy of Engineers report, and actually umpteen others, multiple other reports, have all essentially said the same thing. But the public publics who are protesting, at least in some parts of the world, about fracking, are coming at it from a different angle. They're coming at it from the values angle and from the my pain, your gain angle. And so there's a group that dislike fracking because they dislike fossil fuels. There's another group that dislike fracking because they actually just don't like big companies. And then there's a third group who just don't want the inconvenience of having something industrial happening in their backyard. And I think that unless we understand and analyze that different set of issues, then we're in danger of having completely the wrong conversation and actually talking past each other. So analyzing what goes around the sort of public discussion around a technology is very important. Now, one of the things, of course, that we have evolved over the years are regulators as ways of solving these problems for us. And there are some interesting challenges, and I think, again, it goes back to a discussion we've been having before, which is, can we solve all the problems around innovation with legislation? The answer to that is going to be it's extremely difficult to do that, because legislation is a very precise, and in doing so, a rather blunt tool, because you can't specify every possible option in legislation. It's sort of, all or nothing would be an exaggeration, but it's actually a bluntish tool. And so people use regulation, and the question then is how you regulate in the most effective ways. And I think that there are three challenges for regulation, although I believe, and I will show you in a minute, that it is possible to get the regulation right if you do it in a very thoughtful fashion. So the first challenge is regulation in those industries where there isn't a normal free market, that there are semi-monopolistic suppliers, and in the UK, many of our utilities would fall into that category. So we haven't got multiple different water suppliers bringing their own competitive pipes to our front door. And so that has to be regulated. The challenge for the economic regulator is whether the regulator then has the correct incentives. So the incentive they do have is to get us the cheapest water that we can get. But there are other challenges to that, because if we're going to have the sort of innovation that we need, if we're going to have our water system as well as designed as possible, we need other things as well. So you need not only a secure supply of water, it needs to have resilience against shocks, and it needs to innovate. And so you need research and development and the introduction of appropriate innovation to deal with aging infrastructure. And one of the challenges for every part of the world that's had its infrastructure for a long time is that it is tending to age. And what we need to do is to extend the life of our infrastructure, but also to ensure that we can evolve it to the infrastructure that's going to last us the next 100 years. And of course, much of our UK infrastructure, for example, in London, until recently, we've still been dependent on the great sewers built by Victorian engineers. So the question is whether the economic regulator has the right incentives, or whether by being strict on economic regulation alone, they have the potential to drive out innovation, R&D, and resilience. The second problem of regulation is something, again, that we've discussed this afternoon already, which is the challenge of what I call asymmetric incentives. And what I mean by that is that if you're a regulator deciding whether to allow something to happen or not, then you will get into terrible trouble if you allow something to happen that causes harm. But you will not get into trouble if you stop something happening that would have done good. And that's one of the challenges for regulators, and it's not an easy one to solve. And the only way you can probably do it is by finding mechanisms for making people making decisions about this accountable for all of their decisions, both to let something happen and to stop something happening. And then the third challenge for regulation is encrusted or burdensome regulation. In other words, what has tended to happen, and drugs regulation in some ways is an example, although I think I'm being potentially a little unfair to that. We've developed systems of regulation which have become more and more elaborate, and we're very good at adding to regulation. We're quite poor at subtracting things which turn out to be redundant or unnecessary. And so I don't want this section of my talk in any sense to be taken as a sort of generic criticism of regulation, because I think regulation is extremely important. The challenge is actually to make the regulation work in the most effective fashion. That takes me briefly to the precautionary principle, which is something that is discussed a great deal in Europe, and where I think there is the danger of misapplying it. Now, the first thing to say is there is no single definition of the precautionary principle. There are lots of international agreements, organizations. There have been different definitions of it over the year. There isn't one, as it were, biblical interpretation of the precautionary principle. The EU communication from 2000, based on the fullest possible scientific evaluation of the hazard, a decision to act or not preceded by risk evaluation of those hazards and consequences of inaction. So this does distinguish between hazard and risk, involves transparency, and takes into account the principles of risk management, proportionate response, risk-benefit analysis, cost of action or inaction, reviewed in light of new science. Now, described in that way, that must be an entirely sensible thing to do. But the question is how it is actually interpreted. And I think increasingly there's been a tendency to use the precautionary principle as a red light that says stop, full stop, as opposed to we need to pause, we maybe need to find things out, but it's not an absolute go, no-go. And so, of course, the precautionary principle makes perfect sense, but the question with anything like that is it applied in an appropriate fashion? And of course, you can only do that at the end of the day if you actually understand the terminology, and it does go back to that sort of capacity to have good risk discussions. So let me turn to a contentious area in this audience, but one where I think the UK has achieved a form of regulation that serves us well. And it's in the area of embryology, fertility, fertilization, treatments of various sorts, IVF, for example, in vitro fertilization. And many years ago, the UK set up a body called the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. And this is an example of a regulator that's worked in an area of emerging science. And that's one of the challenges with innovation, that actually innovation doesn't come fully formed. It emerges. There's new experiments, there's new innovation, things are tried, things do work, things don't work. How do you actually legislate and regulate in an advancing field of innovation? And so the model here is, if you like, a thoughtful regulator. And what it does is it basically assesses the policy issues related to fertility regulation. It's in an area which is undoubtedly ethically and clinically complex. It takes scrupulous care in assessing a wide range of data and evidence, so it does evidence reviews, it looks at what's going on. It has a comprehensive program of public engagement, so it's part of the discussion with the public. This is a regulator that works openly in consultation. And it's been very effective at building trust in the community. And of course, it's worked closely with legislators in Parliament, And so from time to time, new regulations or new legislation is needed to allow something to happen. And so there's this very good interplay between a regulator, which is, if you like, a thoughtful regulator, and I'm sure all regulators are thoughtful, but there are sort of processes that go through that I think make it extra thoughtful, and Parliament. Now, it's absolutely clear this is a value-laden area. There are some people, and I've supported some of the research in this area when I was at the Wellcome Trust, and for example, the treatment of mitochondrial diseases is something that's now becoming possible through research. This is highly contentious. There are some people who, for very strong, personally held reasons, believe that this is the wrong thing to do. The challenge there, that's not a scientific challenge. That is actually a challenge for democracies. That's why we have democracies, and ultimately it is our legislators that have to decide what to do. But this is a way of having the best conversation. And as a result, in relation to the values in the UK, this is an area where the UK has, I think, a very strong opinion, though I recognize that some people will disagree. And that takes me to, in some senses, how I got here. And I think I got here through two journeys, really. The first was my time in medicine, and I chaired an ethical research committee at Hammersmith Hospital in Imperial College many years ago. And through the work of 10 years as director of the Wellcome Trust, having to think about some of these areas, and then coming into the world of government, where you suddenly discover that it's all about risk. And how do you think about risk? How do you manage it? How do you provide the scientific evidence on the one hand, recognizing that it is contingent, it's evolving, but policymakers can't always wait. Scientists sometimes say, well, terribly sorry, Minister, that's the wrong question. Or they say, yeah, Minister, that's a very good question. If you give me £5 million in 10 years, I'll be able to give you the answer. But actually, the policymaker needs to make a decision rather sooner than that. And so what I'm doing, and we'll be publishing fairly soon, is producing an annual report, which is actually copying an idea that my close colleague Dame Sally Davis, who's the Chief Medical Officer in the UK, does each year, which is to produce an annual report, and she's just produced one on mental health. But fairly recently, she produced one on antimicrobial resistance, which I think is recognized around the world as one of the big scientific challenges that's facing us, because we took antibiotics for granted. But it's the nature of Darwinian selection that exposed to an antibiotic, a microorganism will evolve changes that will make it resistant. And so I've taken a sort of slightly more open topic for this year, which is on the topic of managing risk and not, as it were, ducking it. And hopefully that will be published sometime in the next couple of months. But as part of that work, I think we have to have a stronger European discussion. I think we have to have a stronger global discussion. And I would argue that I think one of the challenges for Europe is for the scientific community to come up with the best advice to policymakers, both nationally and in Brussels, so that we can have the most effective and thoughtful both legislation and regulation. And I think one of the problems that we have in science in Europe is the transmission mechanisms between the scientific community and governments and the Commission and the Parliament. And I think that's one of the challenges. And I don't think there's an easy answer, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to how scientific advice gets into government. I happen to be quite attached to the UK model for fairly obvious reasons, but it isn't the only model, I think. So, to finish, I think we do need a wider, a more thoughtful debate and engagement on the subject of risk. Risk as a whole, actually, but particularly risk into the context of innovation, where we frankly need innovation if we're going to manage some of the grand challenges that face the global population of humans and all the other species with whom we share our planet. I think that we should improve our understanding of different forms of innovation and how they result in risks. And so I think that discussion about taxonomy is quite important, otherwise we can't have the best conversations. I do think we need more adaptive forms of regulation, recognizing that you're trying to regulate in an evolving field. That's very different from regulating something which is well established. And then I think that we need to look at the balance of incentives. to work out how we're actually going to manage the my pain, your gain, and all of these other issues around innovation, which are around people's values of equity and fairness. And I think that's probably the best note to end on. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mark, for a wonderful talk and also for stressing the importance of various aspects of risk. One point I would be particularly interested in to learn more about what you stressed several times, transparency, public engagement. Question that always concerns us in Germany is how can we actually manage to overcome the asymmetries between the knowledgeable expert and the layperson in the room?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And I think in a sense it is actually about recognizing that we have to find that citizens as a whole are a pretty smart lot. I mean, we're all in this together. And so what we've got to do is find language and ways of communicating rather than saying we're the experts, we're sort of going to hand the knowledge down. And I think it's how you have those conversations. But it's how you have the conversations which are not polarized by special interest groups. And so the challenge is you have, as it were, a town hall meeting on GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and then you have half the audience or three-quarters of the audience who are curious, who don't have, they just want to find out, they want to discuss. But then you have a small number of people who are advocates, lobbyists for either one side or the other, and you get a distorted conversation as a result. And it's how you actually have the deliberative conversation, how you have the debate in a way that really is democratic and isn't dominated by people that have one obsessive view versus another.
Well, the floor is open for questions.
So I think your important distinctions of hazard and risk is very practically useful, for instance, in the case of dual-use research of concern.
Yes.
Here we are actually in most cases talking about hazard, not about real risk. And people don't really consider that important difference in the discussion.
That is absolutely right. I mean, it only becomes a risk if you have an exposure. We had the discussion about dual use in the last discussion, and I think the challenge is it comes down to the fact that almost every technology has the potential to do bad things or good things. And there is, I think, no right answer to the question about how much research you should do to try and understand how flu is pathogenic. And I think that what worried me about that particular episode when people were exploring the virulence factors in avian influenza was probably not so much, as it were, the danger of this research revealing knowledge that would then be used for evil purposes. There's also where the hazard becomes a risk, actually, is the risk of a laboratory accident resulting in the escape of the organism. And I think that one's just got to be very careful if you're working with very dangerous organisms, that it's done under the most careful conditions, which of course it can be. And so that's, if you like, that's when you turn a hazard into a risk, if you're working on a dangerous agent and it escapes.
All right, Thomas Brunner.
I'm not sure if I may ask this question. Perhaps it's a bit impertinent, but I was wondering if during the last few months you have ever deliberated in your institutions about the potential societal risk of Scotland becoming independent from the UK, or has the UK never been exposed to this hazard?
Well, I'll give you a sort of slightly indirect answer to the question, which is that one of the things that I do, and the Government Office for Science does, is that we are responsible for horizon scanning and foresight in government. And so amongst the projects that we are actively working on and have been working on are some of the big questions relating to how people live. And there are three that we've been looking at. We've been looking at demography, because actually what policies governments have depend critically on knowing who's living in your country. The second area is on future cities, because as we become increasingly urbanized, both in Europe but around the world as a whole, what will a city look like in 2065? Will we be talking about individual cities? Will we be talking about city regions? What are the issues of governance? Everyone talks about a smart city. Well, what's a dumb city? But what do we need to make a smart city? How do we use information in the best way? And the third project that we're doing, which is not, again, related in many ways, is on aging. Because every society really has aging populations. And so if you take demography, aging in cities, you could say that's life, the universe, and everything. So we do think about the future, but I very carefully haven't answered your question.
Yeah, Posselt, and then the next one.
I have a question concerning, for example, if you think of TTIP,
yes,
the trade negotiations, a lot of that goes also around innovation. So, and that is purely a political discussion today,
yes.
A discussion of which is influenced by company interests, business associations, and so on. What can scientists actually contribute to that? Is there a chance that there is something like a scientific dialogue across nations that can seriously gain some influence on these on types of these negotiations?
I think there is quite an important role, and so in New Zealand recently, there was a very long-running dispute between New Zealand and Australia on apples. Now, I think the danger is that science inappropriately gets sucked in to discussions about trade barriers, and we've got to be very careful not to use pseudoscience in the service of promoting trade barriers. I think that's the challenge. So I think the role of science is to provide the best possible evidence, but again, not go beyond that. And TTIP ultimately depends on all the lenses that I've talked about earlier and more, actually. So I think science is about doing the best you can, but just being a bit careful that you don't get sucked into pseudoscience for the purpose of trade barriers.
Okay, the next one.
At the beginning of your talk, you pointed out that some of the key infrastructure in this room was the electrical supply.
Yeah.
And previous speakers have talked about Fukushima.
Yeah.
So the German government, I believe, is the only one that made a decision to pull out of nuclear power soon after Fukushima. What is your view on this?
I'm certainly not going to engage
Absolutely.
I'm certainly not going to engage in a discussion of, Germany's policies on anything. What I think I tried to do in my talk was to expose the basis for different attitudes to different technologies in different countries. And then I think each country has got to work through that individually and how it works with others. But it comes back to the fact that we have this very complicated mix in energy between sustainability, affordability, and then it's quite interesting because you can look at each of the areas of energy supply, and all of them are subject then to a values discussion. So wind is subject to a values discussion, shale gas is subject to a values discussion, nuclear is the subject to a values discussion, and I'm afraid each country's got to work this out for itself.
May I ask a short follow-up question?
Yeah.
Has the UK, you think, gone through that type of evaluation in a way that you're satisfied with?
Tries to get it out of you.
I can tell you. Well, I'll say two things. I think, firstly, if you look at the public attitude to nuclear energy, and there's lots of data from different countries, then interestingly, the sort of the needle on the dial did not move significantly in the UK after Fukushima. Now, you can ask what the cause and the explanation was, and causation and correlation are, as everyone knows, it's a sort of most basic level sciences. They are not the same thing. But one thing that did happen rapidly in the UK was that because of the ability to assemble SAGE, the Scientific Advice Group in Emergencies, very quickly, there was an extremely clear communication about Fukushima in UK political circles and public circles very, very quickly. And I think that's just important as a generic thing. And, the position in the UK at the moment is that we are actively aiming to build a new nuclear power station, nuclear power stations. So that is the resolution of what's actually happening. But as I say, different countries have got to work this out.
Thank
Norbert Losser.
You were talking about managing risk.
Yeah.
Now, there's another category, and that is called ignoring risks.
Yes.
And for example, if it comes to information technology, the use of social networks, IT security, and so on, we see, consequently, that both society, but maybe government as well, is ignoring risk in the sense that we simply do things, although we know it's not healthy to do it.
Well, I think I would disagree with your assertion that the risks are being ignored. I don't know of any government that isn't thinking extremely active about this, actually. It's in the public domain as well. You need hardly turn the corner to find some discussion about the risks associated with that. But of course, one has to recognize the other side of the coin is that particularly younger generations have taken up the internet, the information age extraordinarily rapidly. And so it does provide huge utility. And we've got to be extremely careful, I think, that we balance that utility against all of the security issues, which, if you like, have emerged at a slightly later stage. So I think there is a very active discussion. And again, it's about proportionate regulation. And one of the sort of novel challenges of the information technology era is that it is transnational, global, in a way that many other technologies aren't. And yet there's not a good or even a likely global framework for providing a sort of tight level of regulation. But it is very important, and we need to think, one of the things that we need to think about when we're building the Internet of Things is how, if you like, you build the security into that. And the security matters for two reasons. It matters because we worry about what happens to our personal information, that we have to have assurances around that. But equally, it has the potential for attack in a way that our infrastructure didn't have before. So again, another issue which I could have talked about at some length is that our electricity supply is not only dependent on the generation of electricity and the power lines, it's dependent on the internet, on satellite systems. All of our infrastructures are now mutually interdependent in a way that they were less so before. And the point about power is that in some ways it's at the top of the hierarchy, because if the power goes out, the water stops flowing as well, waste stops going. And so almost everything is dependent on power. But equally, now everything is becoming interdependent, and our infrastructure is very dependent now on IT systems. And sometimes the sort of Pandora's box argument is opened, which is that a new technology offers a potential existential threat to us. But the reality is that we opened Pandora's box when we learnt how to chip away stones and to use metal. And so we've got plenty of technology which has the potential to cause us terrible problems. And I think it's very difficult to say we should stop all new technologies because we're in danger of opening Pandora's box. I fear we've done it already.
I see no more hands up for asking for the floor. Then I take this opportunity to thank you once again, Mark, for a wonderful speech and also for your contributions to the debate. Given the fact that this is the 300th anniversary of the personal union between England and the Kingdom of Hanover, I have a present for you which is up there, which I will give to you in a minute. Einen schönen Abend Ihnen allen.